Sudhir Pandey, and I welcome you to Ahmedabad University and to the Conversation Series webinar. Before I begin the proceedings, I would request everybody to, as it is, you all are muted, but if in case it is not happening, please mute yourself. Only the two people who will be in conversation, they will be unmuted. And if you are joining from a mobile, please rename yourself so that when you ask a question or you give any opinion, we are able to identify you. So that will be the some of the admin rules. And I'm really excited today to welcome Sandeep today to Ahmedabad University. I have been following him when I got to know about his book last year, somewhere around October. And it is always a pleasure to welcome you, Sandeep. And thank you so much for joining us. Just a quick introduction. Sandeep Dayal did his MBA from Yale School of Management. And after that, he is a seasoned marketing and strategy leader with 20 plus years of experience across industries, in addition to serving as the managing director wing. He serves as a counselor to C-suite executive and board members at Fortune 500 companies. He has served 50 plus clients in over 100 engagements around the world, including 15 plus major countries in European Union, Latin America, and Asia. He's regarded as one of the leading minds in marketing strategy and has co-authored articles in marketing management, McKinsey, Quarterly, and strategy and business. And there is one particular quote from Sandeep that I would like to read today, and I believe this is very impactful. It says that, this is a quote from Sandeep's article, "You become a brand with courage when the social issues align deeply with the core values of the company. Thus, having a clear credo of corporate value that don't shift with the sand of time is important." This is about the brand of courage. And he gives another concept, brand with empathy. And he says that you become a brand with empathy when your customers expect you to do the right thing, or when your employees would no longer believe in your brand. And when you do that, you do it with certain conviction. So I really like these two classifications of brand with courage and brand with empathy. And we are really happy to have you, Sandeep, today. Welcome to Ahmedabad University.
Well, thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. And the person who will be in conversation with Sandeep is our own Professor Ravi Miglani. And he's again from the same area. He's also an industry guy, has 35 years of experience. So he did his MBA from Indian Institute of Management. After that, he went to market research and related areas. And most of the students know that he has developed a very interesting course called Interdisciplinary Approach to Consumer Understanding. And this course uses the principles of marketing research, but recognizing the limitations of traditional research. The course uses the thinking and methodologies of adjacent disciplines like neuromarketing, behavioral economics, and ethnography to fully understand the consumer choices at a very deep level. So we have no other person better than Professor Miglani to have this conversation. So I hand it over to you, sir, and I request you to take this forward.
Thank you so much, Sudhir, and welcome again, Sandeep. And for those who might not know, Sandeep has woken up very early in the morning. Sandeep is based in Chicago in the United States, and he's woken up very early in the morning with temperature outside around minus 10 degrees, I believe. So that shows some commitment from Sandeep to wake up on a cold early morning to talk to us. So let's give our full attention to Sandeep and ask lots of questions, difficult questions as well, because that's how we learn, as we always say in our classrooms, that you don't learn by sitting and listening to a professor lecture you for an hour. That is not a very good way of learning. We learn by engaging and asking questions. So we'll keep enough time to ask questions. But while Sandeep and I are talking, feel free to keep typing your questions into the chat box, and we will pick up most of them at the latter part of today's event. So Sandeep, we will talk about brand and branding and marketing in general, and how to build connections with consumers. These are topics that many of our students, and I see a lot of our marketing and MBA students attending today, so they will certainly be very interested in. So Sandeep has kind of summarized his several decades of learning on this by consulting and advising brands on their strategy into a book, which you might have seen, which was in the registration link that got to you. So yes, the book called Right Between the Ears, and which obviously is our brain is right between the ears, how to use brain science to build epic brands. So that's the topic today. We all, those of us interested in marketing, would like to build a brand in the consumer mind and build long-lasting connections. And again, as I often say to my students and colleagues, that we are all marketing people. So there is, every one of us is a marketing person, whether you are in supply chain or distribution or HR, we are marketing something. We are marketing our proposals, we are marketing our ideas, we are marketing ourselves. We have moved to a stage in the world where we are all brands, and personal branding, I think we talk about often at the university. We all need to do personal branding. How do we position ourselves as a brand which may be of use and which may be attractive to potential employers or potential business partners and so on. So we are all marketing people, whether or not our course title or our job title says marketing. So it's a topic of great interest to all of us. So Sandeep, can we start with branding 101? What is a brand? And I think we often get confused between a brand and a product. So if a can of Coca-Cola, which I pick up from the supermarket shelf, is that the brand?
Yeah, so I think that's a great place to start the discussion. So you have students who have gone through the marketing course here. So the traditional view of branding has been around differentiation, right? Product differentiation, which is, if I look at it, I say, look, I have product X and my competition has product Y and product Z. And what is the difference, right? What is the difference between my product and those other products? And therefore, my brand is going to be about those differences. So I call that basically product differentiation. But what we are finding is that branding is actually a lot more than just talking about the distinctions between different products. And we tend to think of brands as almost having a soul. So there is the perceived part of the brand, and there is the unseen or the unperceived part of the brand, which is kind of its soul, it's kind of the DNA. And it is all of those things that start making a difference. And let me just give you an example. When I was back in India, when I was going through engineering school, I was in BITS Pilani, and we used to have, these test series, which were incredibly brutal, very difficult test series that we used to have. And I still remember there was we had a series which was modern physics, and everybody went and took the test. Out of a maximum of 36, the class average was 6. So, half the people were below 6. So you can imagine what these things were. So what used to happen was that after the test series were finished, people would sort of want to just relax and enjoy companionship and so on, right? Be with friends and so on. So we would buy this bottle of Old Monk rum, which you are all familiar with. It's a very famous brand of rum in India, Old Monk. And so we'd get, Old Monk, and then we'd pour it into a plastic bucket and then, make some kind of a punch out of it, and everybody would have a great time. So for me, for some people, you might just say, okay, Old Monk is this bottle and it has this label, and that's what the brand, that's what the brand is. But for me, it's much more than that, because in that bottle are encompassed all of my memories of being in college and, enjoying the time with my friends, coming out of those test series and feeling that relief and everything. And in fact, recently, Old Monk rum has been made available in the United States. At Binny's, I can go here. I live in Chicago. I can go to Binny's and I can pick up a bottle. And I have to pay 3 times the price of what I would pay for a Bacardi rum or something. But, it has some special meaning for me because it brings those memories back. So remember, that's what happens with all brands and with all products, that our brain associates something with them which is beyond just the differences that you see. And you can think of that as the soul of the brand or what have you. So for you as marketers, it is that, getting an understanding of that soul and being able to differentiate your brand on the basis of the unseen becomes very important. Product differences don't go away, by the way. We also know from brain sciences that our brain tends to focus on differences. Okay, so if you put things alike, your brain will very quickly try to say, okay, what's different here? So to, focus in on that. But just because it notices differences, it doesn't mean that it prefers differences, right? And when we're talking about preference, which is what you're trying to do when you're doing branding, you're trying to influence choice, you're trying to influence preference. That is where something more than those perceptible product differences comes in. So it's not just product differentiation, brand differentiation, product differentiation, two different things.
So,
okay.
So we build these connections in the mind of the consumer at an emotional level, and you have nostalgia, you have emotions, you have memories attached to old monk rum and so on, which for instance, old monk rum, officially we do not have any connections with it because we are in Gujarat. So Gujarat is the so that I think our audience might not be able to go and pick up a bottle of old monk even if they wanted to. But that aside, so if I have to take a product that people in Gujarat can pick up on a supermarket shelf, say, as I started talking about Coca-Cola. So if I go into a supermarket or a cafe and there's a Coca-Cola and a Pepsi and a Thumbs Up, and all of them over many, many years have built those emotional connections, those preferences in our mind. So what chance do I have as, say, a marketing or branding person working for Coca-Cola to make sure that my brand gets picked up when all of these have such strong resonances and memories and nostalgia in the consumer mind? So you earlier mentioned that differentiation is no longer enough, which is true in most product categories these days, because as we know, there's a lot of research being done that when people are given a Coke and a Pepsi in a blind format,
yeah,
can't even recognize which is Coke and which is Pepsi. So it's not product differentiation, it's the differentiation in the memories, the associations, the emotions. So what chance do I have as Coca-Cola when other big heritage brands like Thumbs Up and Pepsi have very strong emotions in the consumer mind as well?
Yes. So let me just comment on two things there. Yes, I did forget that maybe the old monk example isn't the best example for the audience in Gujarat, although you do have a broader audience as well. But nonetheless, I just very quickly, I just want to mention, because just recently, one of my friends posted a picture of his socks on LinkedIn. And these were like, very dirty socks that he's had for over 15 years. And this, so whatever. So it had stains on it, it had tears on it and so on. And he was having a very difficult time taking these socks and throwing them away, because those were the socks that he wore when he was doing cross-country biking, cycling with his friends. So it sort of reminded, those socks were kind of a reminder for him, of all the great times that he had with his friends going on those long distance cycling events and so on. So the point is, even something simple like socks can have so much meaning, and people can have a very difficult time parting with a pair of socks because that brand gets associated with those memories and so on, right? So that's one of the key ideas here. The second thing is, and in my book, actually, I do, as part of the definition of the brands, I basically say that brands are the keys to unlocking our past memories, our past experiences. They're the keys to potentially unlocking our fantasies. So that is what the function of the brands becomes. And it's a different way of looking at what a definition of a brand is. So there's that. Now, you were raising the question around Coke, coming into the market and sort of competing with Pepsi, with Thumbs Up and so forth. And that is true. And that is part of the idea that it should be very difficult for somebody else to come in, because if you're putting in all this time and money into building your brands, that's the whole point of it, right? Because once you build those lasting connections and you make those investments, you own those relationships. And it's not very easy for somebody else to just walk in and sort of say, oh, I want all your relationships. And that is what we are trying to do as marketers, which is why it is important to do it beyond the differentiation. In the example that you gave, it is true that when they've done blind taste tests, so you do Coke, you do Pepsi, you put something else like RC Cola, you may actually find that RC Cola wins the taste test. Okay, but these are blind taste tests. But when you unblind the taste tests and you say, this is Coke, this is Pepsi, this is this, which one do you prefer now? Most people prefer Coke. And that really illustrates, because that's a much more realistic situation, because when you're going and buying Coke or soda, you're not buying it blinded. You're buying it with the brand on it. So the more realistic test is actually with the brand put on it. And when you do the same test, but put the brand on there, then the Coca-Cola wins over Pepsi and RC Cola. And that is because of the power of brands.
So when we say that we have built these long-standing associations and memories and so on, and we often say that most brand choices for a lot of product categories are made at a subconscious level, or what Daniel Kahneman is a psychologist who we refer to often in our courses here, and he talks of it in terms of system 1 and system 2 brain, that most choices are made at a system 1 level, which is the intuitive, emotional brain, which doesn't think through things logically. And we do not engage our system 2 brain, which is the logical, rational part of the brain, for most choices we made. We are almost on autopilot. We just let our system 1 decide what we want to, what choices we want to make. And we don't also even consciously, even ourselves, know why we are making those choices. So the question that I get often asked is, if the consumer herself doesn't know why she's making those choices, what chance do you marketing people have on knowing why consumers are making those choices? So I often don't have a good answer for that, that if the consumers don't know, how do I know?
Yeah. So let me unpack that a little bit, since you talked about a number of different things there. So traditionally in marketing, we have had this view that the brain makes decisions functionally, and which is rationally and emotionally. That's partly true, right? I mean, we are familiar with emotions, we are familiar with the rational, and that's been the prevailing model of branding over the last, I would say, 30 years, if you will. With Kahneman's work, Daniel Kahneman's work, I take a slightly different perspective to it. It's not just the rational emotional model anymore. It's more the system 1 and system 2 model. And for those of your listeners that are not familiar with system 1 and system 2, in very simply speaking, what Kahneman says is that you have a part of your brain which makes choices or makes decisions. And remember, branding is all about making choices. So makes choices, makes decisions using, very instinctively, gut feel, instinctively. And really, where is that instinct coming from? It's coming from your past experiences, right? So those are the choices that you make just in an instant, using your gut feel, using your past experience, and your brain does that automatically, subconsciously, without you even having to think about it. That's the point. So I call that in one, system 1 is kind of a little weird in terms of a term. Think of it as the instinctive part of your brain. And then the second part of your brain is the deliberative part of the brain, which is where you'll sit down and you have to make a choice. Maybe you're buying a mortgage or something like that, or you're buying a car, and you may want to sit down and say, hey, wait a minute, this is a pretty expensive thing. I better think about this very carefully. And you may do a spreadsheet, you may do a pros and cons of different car models and so on. So that is, in one word, the deliberative part of the brain. So on one side, somebody asks you 2 + 2, that's an instinctive, 4. You immediately say that, because that's why somebody says multiply 27 by 13, you use the deliberative part of your brain. Now, the other myth that you have to sort of also understand is that the instinctive part of the brain Sometimes, it does make mistakes because, you're making decisions by gut feel, right? So you may make a wrong decision, but most of the time it works pretty well. 80%, 90% of the time you will make a good decision just using instinct. And that's why what psychologists these days say is that of all the choices that you make on any given day, 95% of your choices are made instinctively. Even though all of us try to think that we are very rational people and we make choices very deliberatively, those choices are made instinctively. So that's one part of it, that most of the time we're using instinct. Second part to remember is that instinctive choice can actually be very sophisticated. You shouldn't think of instinctive choice as irrational or dumb. When you're driving a car or when you're playing tennis, you make very sophisticated decisions. Your brain is making all these decisions around, how you're going to avoid the traffic, how you're going to do, how fast you're going to drive, how much the accelerator you're going to press. You're not doing calculations around any of those things. Those things are just happening because they are just instinctive to you. And those are very sophisticated decisions, which even artificially intelligent computers these days and cars have a difficult time making. Same thing when you're playing tennis. If there's a ball coming at you at 90 miles an hour, you automatically, if you're a tennis player, you automatically instinctively make the adjustments and do that. If you were thinking there and doing a spreadsheet about that, you would be hit by the ball. So instinctive choices actually is most of the time very sophisticated because it is based on the vast experiences and habits and things that we've built in our entire lifetime. And then you have, of course, deliberative choice. Now, a lot of people refer to instinctive choice as cognitive biases, especially if you are a student of behavioral economics. You will see that term cognitive bias used all the time. I don't actually like that term. I tend to use the term cognitive wisdom, for example, because it's wisdom because it is the wisdom that we have learned from all our past experiences, right? So, for example, from your past experiences, you may make the rule that given two possible solutions to a problem, the simpler solution is the better one. Okay. Now that is not always quite true, but that is called the Occam's razor principle, and most of us like that idea that the simpler answer is the better answer, right? And in India, sometimes people say, Sida Sasta Sundar. What is that Sida? Why do people like Sida? Because that's the simple answer. So that is the cognitive wisdom that you might have, but the Sida answer or the simple answer may not be the right answer all the time, but maybe 80-90% of the time it is the right thing to do. So as a brand marketer, knowing that people have that bias, you might position your brand as the simple choice, the easy choice. So in the United States, for example, we have an office products company called Staples, and their advertisement is all around an easy button, right? So they put this in all their ads, you see this big red easy button. And what they're saying to you instinctively, that is what they're appealing to you, that, hey, don't think about all these different choices you have from my competitors. Come to Staples because this is the easy choice. Everything that you want will get done very easily. Likewise, there's a number of people who market frozen food, for example, or prepared meals. And prepared meals, again, they're saying, life is so complex. There's a company called HEB here, which sells these. And basically they say, life is so complex. Life is crazy. Just buy our prepared meals. Why make mealtime to be so complicated? So essentially, it is these rules over our lifetimes. As we go through our lives, we form and accumulate a lot of rules in our minds, and we apply those rules instinctively, like simple is the better answer, or stick with what you have, and so on. And you can design your brands to conform to those rules, which is a new way of thinking about it versus saying, I'm going to design my brand to appeal to emotional attributes. There's nothing intrinsically valuable about emotional attributes. Like, just because you and I strike up an emotional discussion doesn't mean that we like each other. It's just an emotional discussion. But we could. I mean, emotions are shown to strengthen relationships and to strengthen memories in particular. So just when I was describing the old monk experience, or I was describing the socks experience, there are emotions and nostalgia, as you rightly pointed out, that are associated with those moments. And that strengthens those memories, as in our brains, they're written much more clearly.
So we've talked, maybe just for the benefit of some of the audience, if you didn't catch what Sandeep was telling us about, this is the guy, Daniel Kahneman. My students who I interact with, I keep flashing this book to them every couple of weeks, to the extent that they have started thinking that I'm a book salesman. I'm pushing this book to them. But to those who haven't, look at this book by Daniel Kahneman called Thinking Fast and Slow, where this whole concept of system one, intuitive brain versus deliberative brain and so on. But there's a lot of interesting material there. You have in your book this whole process of creating that kind of deep connection with the consumer. You use the phrase cognitive branding. Would you be able to give us a little more on why do you call it cognitive branding, and what happens when you build a cognitive brand?
Like I said, historically, our brand models for the last 30 years have been built around this whole idea of functional and emotional. What in the book, right between the years that I've written, and the way that I propose there is what Kahneman has described how our brain works, which is by system one and system two. He didn't say in his book that it works as functional and emotional. He said it works as system one and system two. So we have to sort of start thinking as marketers, we owe it to ourselves to say, okay, that is how choice is made, and that is what psychologists today and brain scientists today are saying about how choice is made, then we need to align our models accordingly. And that is what I have done with this concept of cognitive branding. And in cognitive branding, I put 3 parts to it. So the first part is, as you saw in the survey, around brand vibes, which is where you sort of ask yourself the question, do I feel a connection with this brand? Is there a shared chemistry with this brand? And this is just very similar, if you will, to how we feel connection with people, right? When you and I are sort of talking to each other, if we feel connected to each other, if we feel like we understand each other, then you are going to believe more of what the other person says. And that's where this whole idea of brands with empathy or brands with values comes in. So that's branding model, is to really say, okay, how do people make sense out of things? Well, we know through Kahneman, right, they're going to either deliberatively think about the problem, or they're going to use their instinct and their past experience to think. And then the last part, which was the third question, which was in the survey, which is, will this brand make me happier? And that sounds a little hokey, but the point is that in psychology these days, the most research that is going on today in the field of psychology is around this whole field of happiness. And generally what people have found is that we as human beings are wired to pursue happiness. Okay, we're always a little unhappy, which is a good thing, because if you're perfectly happy, and we do what is called goal pursuit, or we try to do different things to either enhance our identities or to strengthen our relationships and so on, and that leads to us taking action. And there's a lot of research that has been done, particularly by 2 psychologists, Dacey and Ryan at the University of Rochester, and they have shown that we pursue goals, we pursue happiness, and when we think that certain brands, and this is more my extension of their work, which is when we think that certain brands are going to make us happier, those brands. So think of, so that this cognitive branding model, this is really a model which says that there is this notion of cognitive brands and that they work better because they're aligned to work the way that our brain does, right? And we know a lot about how our brain works, which is through empathy, values, and so on. And through system 1, system 2, and through resolve, which is around goal pursuit. So remember those 3 things: the brand vibes, brand sense, and brand resolve, which are aligned around those things. So there was this discussion about brands with empathy and brands with courage, or what I call brands with values. So I'm going to show you an example of a brand with empathy, and I picked an Indian example. There are some advertisements, as you guys are familiar with, in India that have been done by Tanishq, which is a brand from Tata's. And they've done advertisements around, they have a brand called Mia, which is a jewelry brand, which is directed at women, working women. And in that, what they've done is that they show in this ad, and you can watch it on YouTube, by the way, all these ads are on YouTube, so you can go and watch them in your free time. But they talk about this woman, and they show her, going to work and so on, and they show these various vignettes in there in which they talk about how people are talking and saying that, hey, she's succeeding because she's a woman, right? Whereas what the ad says is she's succeeding because she's doing great work. So they're picking up on that whole empathy, or they're picking up in this whole angst that women often feel, that when they go to work and they do well and they progress, people say, oh no, they're not doing well because they're talented, but they're doing well because they're just women and they're being treated treated differently. And by picking up on that angst, you can see that Tanishq is able to make that special connection with working women, where they feel like, gee, this brand really understands us. So think of that as an example where where a brand marketer is not so much talking about how the jewelry is different from somebody else's jewelry. The jewelry in that ad, you will just see the women wearing jewelry and so on, a little bangle here, a little something there, a little necklace there, but they don't explicitly talk about how that necklace or that bangle is different from other bangles that are available in the market. They only talk about how women's talents and women's talents are being marginalized by this. So the second example that I wanted to talk about was Tata Tea, which was number 3 in the market initially. And then, they became one of the top brands. They became number 1 for a while. And they were what I would describe as a brand with courage, or a brand with values. And they had this campaign, as many of you are familiar with, which was around the Jagore, right? Which was to say that, hey, your morning tea is not just about awakening, the morning tea is not just about waking up, but it is about awakening. And they have all of this around these different ads in which they talk about, people holding politicians accountable for performing, people, going and voting and expressing their making their voices heard, young people who often don't vote, encouraging them to go and vote and sort of, and sort of awaken and take part in this nation and sort of fight corruption and so on. And that was, again, one of those things which you would say, like, what's that got to do with tea, right? Encouraging people to go and vote, encouraging people to fight corruption, encouraging gender equality, which are all the different things that Tata Tea tackled. You would say, well, what has that got to do with tea? But it has to do with the values of the company and the values of that brand, right? And not all brands can be brands with values, but in that particular case, they've elected to go into that path where they're a brand with value. And again, it's something very different from saying, oh, look at my tea, it's different because it has the longest, leaves, or these are leaves, but that are specially grown. None of those things. All these teas come from the same mountains and same hills in Assam, right? So you can't really say your tea is that different. But nonetheless, by making that brand about Jagore, about awakening versus just waking up, they were able to go from being number 3 to number 1. And it is those types of, that is how you take a brand and give it some soul and give it this extra something that makes it bigger than just the product itself.
Yeah, okay. So firstly, apologies to everyone in the audience. I think both Sandeep and me are occasionally breaking up. So hopefully you will get the gist of what we are trying to talk about. So Sandeep, just to pick up on that, Sudhir, just confirm you can hear me?
Yeah, now it is a lot better than earlier. So,
okay. Yes. All right. So you've talked about Tanishq and Tata Tea and so on, where as we know in today's world, in many product categories, there are no more functional differences. So one tea is as good as another tea, one cola is as good as another cola, one detergent powder is as good as another detergent powder. So in the early days of marketing, you could claim that my detergent washes whiter and removes stains, and my tea has this quality which others don't. So we've kind of gone past that. Every brand is more or less equally good on functional level. So in our in the old days when we were learning marketing a few decades ago, we used to be told to create ladders on how I ladder up my brand from rational to emotional to the soul of the brand. And we had various fancy looking brand equity modules around it at the functional level and emotional level and so on. So those seem to have fallen by the wayside. What is not very clear to me is, has our understanding of consumer brain changed, and therefore we are able to move away from those old style brand models? Or has the consumer themselves changed because they have more information, because there's not top-down sharing of information, everyone knows everything? So what has happened in the last couple of decades that now we need to go into things like what you are proposing, cognitive branding, because brands no longer have a differentiation that they can claim? So has branding changed, or consumers changed, or both?
Yeah. So, again, let me just unpack that into different things. So first part of your question was around, brand ladders and, what are they, and, do we use them still, and what have you? So brand ladders, again, have been around for the last 30 years because they were built around this whole notion of functional and emotional branding, which is, what is the rational benefit of a product? Can I attach some emotion to it? Can I emotionalize the product? And if I can do those two things, then, I can build my brand around that. So an example of that would be that, let's say if you're selling ice cream, and you find that, oh, people want their ice cream to be nice and creamy. That's the attribute, the functional attribute or the rational attribute that they like. And then, you also say, oh, people, eating ice cream seem to be pretty happy. So, maybe I combine the emotion of happiness and creaminess. So, you can have a tagline like, sheer creaminess, sheer happiness, Okay, it sounds like a pretty good tagline, but the thing is that it is not necessarily true that people associate creaminess with happiness, and that is the issue with the laddered branding, that we often have to make these assumptions that may not be actually perfectly true. What is more the case is that we have certain patterns of thought in our minds, and it is that pattern of thought that you want to be able to decode. And which is why, in the cognitive branding model, I say you need to associate these things with certain experiences that people have had in the past, right? Because it's that pattern of thought that is going to trigger it. Let me give you an example. Then this is an example of a product that is also, started in the United States, but is also available in India, which is Act 2 popcorn, which is actually manufactured by one of my clients, Conagra. And when Act 2 started, so this is, microwavable popcorn that we're talking about, and their most successful product when they started out was something called movie theater butter popcorn, right? And you see it's a blue box. It has, like, on the box, it has like a picture of a film, like a movie film on it. And on the film is the, name of the flavor. And then, it also has these Hollywood style incandescent lamps that you see on signs. So you have those, like a Hollywood kind of a sign, and it says Act 2 in between that. So what are they doing? They are sort of tapping into, your experiences. And what is your experience? When do you really enjoy popcorn a lot? You enjoy popcorn a lot when you go to see movies, right? When you go to see movies, you go in there, you buy this big tub of, popcorn with lots of butter in it, and then you sit there and you watch a James Bond movie. You have a great time. You enjoy that. That's a wonderful experience. So what the marketers at Conagra are doing with Act 2 is to sort of say, hey, this is movie theater butter popcorn. Now, you're not really in a movie theater, but when you go and just microwave that popcorn, you're sort of reminded of that beautiful and that immersive experience that you had at the movie theater. So they're using the brand as a key to unlock an experience that you've had in the past. And because that is so powerful, and that experience is so immersive and wonderful and strong for you, that brand became number one in the popcorn category by just tapping into that whole idea. And, so this is a perfect example of you walking into a grocery store and saying, hey, there's so many different microwavable popcorns I can buy, but you end up reaching for this because subconsciously it actually reminds you of that immersive experience you've had when you've gone to movie theaters. So it comes upon to marketers to really start uncovering what these experiences are that people relate these products to. What is this angst, as we saw in the Tata ad? What is that angst that people are feeling that we are going to tap into and sort of associate our brand with? That is where it's a difficult thing to do. These are not easy things to do. The latter approaches and sort of those are in some ways easier because you can design. And, mind you, I'm not going to say, most of your students are going to go to the real world and they're going to work there, and they will find that those are the latter branding is kind of the thing that they will see in some form or fashion mostly. But in the future, you will see more of the cognitive branding approaches as people learn more about it also come into play. So yeah, at this point, it's wise to be smart about both.
So a lot of the examples that we've talked about, whether it's tea or popcorn or cola or old monk rum, very often people say that, yeah, for buying a cola or popcorn, I think seriously, but when I'm buying a car or a house or a phone or a computer, I'm completely rational. Are we completely rational when we're buying high-level products, or does this apply to all kinds of product categories, you think?
So I would say that, particularly when you get into higher risk products, where the ticket size is higher, like a car, a house, and things like that.
No, you didn't.
One would hope that you're being when you're looking at, bigger ticket items, like when you look at, getting a financial mortgage, when you look at buying a car. So these are things that are bigger ticket items. So one would hope that you're being much more rational about it. Now, and particularly when we talk about B2B branding and B2B selling situations, then of course you will find it's pretty common that a company will do a whole spreadsheet and figure out exactly how much certain things are going to cost them. So then you get into this much more rational model where you're looking at, what is the value that I'm getting? What is the cost of the product? And what is the risk that I have? So very traditionally, the components of a cash flow model, or traditionally the components of a net present value, that you can look at the revenues, you look at the costs, you look at the risks. And I do talk about this whole deliberative decision making in the book. The one interesting thing, which again, if you make it less theoretical and you start relating to these things in your experience, what you will find is that this whole notion of instinctive and deliberative thinking actually work together. And what I mean by that is that sometimes you will do a hybrid of the two. So which is that, when you come across a new situation, what you will try to do in your mind is to sort of do some top-down, sanity checks, what we call, so you'll do some level of diligence to see, oh, are these things making sense? So for example, if you walked into, you're buying a car and you walk to the car salesman, he's going to tell you all those things about his car and why his car is the best car option that's available to you. Now, what your mind is going to do is you're going to be asking the question, how much can I trust this guy? And when you think about how much you're going to trust this guy, you are going to try and take selected things that he has said and verify those, validate those, that, are those things true in fact? So you might go and check with your friend who knows a lot about cars that, hey, the sales guy told me that, this is a new type of engine and it works in this, but it's true that he is, that he turned out to be right. Then you might believe everything else that he said also. So, you're not going to go and verify every single thing that he said, but you may verify a few to make sure that he was telling you the truth and he can be trusted. So that's what I call like a top-down sanity check. And very often what happens is that even when we are buying very complicated things, we may actually, even though we should be using a deliberative process, we may take some shortcuts and do a little bit of deliberation and then use some kind of a simplifying mechanism. So for example, why do we do that? Because, doing deliberation is very difficult. It's kind of very painful. It's very stressful. It's like multiplying 17 times 27 in your head. And it's just, stress. And if you can avoid it, the human brain tends to avoid it. So even if you're buying a car, you might actually simplify your life by just going to a friend that you really trust and ask him which car he would buy. And then you say, oh, you drove this car and you buy this car. Okay. If, Rahul is buying that car, then I'm just going to buy the car that Rahul buys. And what you did is you took all that deliberation and analysis that you would have had to do, and you just simplified that decision by using what I might call the expert bias, right? So you decide somebody's an expert and you go with it. And we often do things like that. So it is very important to understand both the deliberative side and the instinctive side, because in real life, we use a combination of these processes when we make choices.
Before we hand over, we do have some questions, but before we hand over to those questions, Sandeep, one issue I think we'll be very keen to have your views on, hopefully if we can hear each other, is very often when I talk to students and others about brain science and how we are able to kind of, in colloquial terms, read the consumer brain, and at the intuitive, emotional, or system one or implicit level, very often people get spooked. This is unethical, that this is some kind of what in the old days we used to call hidden persuaders, that you are trying to hypnotize or brainwash me into buying things that I don't want to buy. And all kinds of other ethical issues, which very often popular media makes stories out of it, that this whole thing of getting into the consumer brain is a bit unethical. How do we approach that? And obviously, it is not unethical, but how does one counter such criticism we hear often?
Sure. So, this is such an interesting thing because on one hand, we also say that, look, consumers are getting to be in more control because now there is the internet, there is the, mobile and so on, and people are talking to each other. And so marketers only have so much control of the conversation versus consumers because the consumers are getting smarter. So that's one side of the argument. And then the second side of the argument is, but wait a minute, as marketers, we are learning so much more about how to understand the subconscious processes that go on in people's brains that we can be controlling their minds, and we could be doing all kinds of unethical things by making them buy things that are really not good for them. So I think, and those are both valid arguments, by the way, and I am glad that your students are asking that question, because the first step to ethical marketing is to ask these questions, right? And so the short answer is that yes, indeed, that with everything that we are learning in brain sciences, marketers today and in the future have greater ability to manipulate consumers. That is the case. And therefore, there is a special responsibility that marketers have to actually not do that and exercise self-control and self-regulation to do what is right. In my book, I give people, 3 questions to think about whenever they're doing something, and if it feels like, gee, this may not be the best thing to do. I give them 3 questions. So the first question is what I call the canonical principle, which is, do unto others what you would they do unto you. So don't do things to others that, that are the kinds of things that you wouldn't want somebody else to do to you, right? That's principle 1. Principle 2, which comes from a famous German philosopher, Immanuel Kant, and it's called the categorical imperative. And it basically says, don't do anything which, if everyone else also started doing, would result in social deterioration or a lack of social good. And he brings this principle in because, people have different moral standards. So you might, if you're a thief, you might say, I don't mind if people steal from me because I also steal from them. So the canonical principle doesn't work in that instance. And you might say, so therefore the categorical imperative says, look, if everybody started stealing, would that be a good thing in society? No, it's not, right? So that's why you shouldn't do that. So that's the second principle. And then the third principle, which is around ethics, is the principle which I call the sunshine imperative, which is anything that you do, if it were to come out in the newspaper on the front pages, is that something that you're going to be embarrassed by? So if it is, then don't do it, right? So those are the 3 types of things that I say don't do. Now, having said that, don't, as long as you sort of follow those 3 principles, there are a lot of other things you can do which are just fine. So for example, people have found that when you're going to a Mexican restaurant, right, and you're eating Mexican food, if they pipe in Mexican music, you will get a better experience, and you will feel that the same food is more tasty, versus in another experiment where you are eating the same Mexican food in the same restaurant, but there is no Mexican music being piped. So now you can say, wait a minute, am I manipulating this person into thinking this Mexican food is better because I piped in Mexican music over it? Well, yeah, you are, but is it unethical? No, because if you go through all of those principles that I talked about, whether it's the sunshine imperative, whether it's the canonical imperative, that's pretty harmless. So use those types of checks to see whether the things that you do are constitute ethical marketing and so on, and you'll be fine.
Excellent. I think those narrowing it down to those 3 principles and kind of checking your actions against those 3. I think it's a very simple rule that we can all live with and apply whenever we're thinking of reaching into the consumer brain and making brand connections there. So Sandeep, as I said, since we keep breaking up and not able to hear each other very well, I'll reserve the rest of my questions to when you visit us in Ahmedabad University. The beautiful campus here, and we will certainly want you to talk in person to our students. I think we've all had enough of Zoom, and today was maybe the last straw of Zoom misbehaving. So let's move on to in-person meeting at some time soon. So in the remaining few minutes, Sudhir and Momita, if we have questions from the audience, let's hopefully be able to hear those questions better than you can hear me.
So now I would like to invite Akshat, if you can switch on your audio and video and ask a question, because you pose very interesting questions, Akshat. So please.
So good evening, sir. It was a really fruitful conversation with you. Thank you for coming. So my only question is about the brand, that how do we rebrand the image of the brand? So first thing is that when we start a brand, or when a company starts a brand, then there is first perspective of the company, that what their brand means in the market. And the second is what the customer thinks about the brand. So how do we either link that, or how do we change the consumer approach for our brand as what we have thought of our brand?
Okay. So, I mean, at the end of the day, I think those are two very good things that you bring up, Akshat. And so in some ways, the ultimate truth of what your brand has to be, even if you're repositioning the brand, has to be driven by what your consumers want, right? What is the experience? What is the fantasy of the consumer that you're going to play into? And then, of course, it has to be also aligned with what your company is, where the company's strengths are, or the capabilities are, or the values are. So, for example, when I was talking about Tata Tea, they did reposition their brand initially around this whole idea of corruption, that there is so much corruption in India, and that we have to, awaken and fight that corruption. And that's a common angst that many Indian consumers have. We've all gone through that, where we've been so frustrated by the corruption that exists in the government and so on. And so they tapped into something that everybody felt very strongly. But your other part of the question is, how does it align with the values of the company, or how does it align with what the company is? Now, remember, Tatas, they have what I would call a special platform from which to address the values of the country, because the Tatas have been committed. This is not a fake pretense thing that they put on just for the purpose of this tea. Tatas have been committed since their very inception to doing charity work, right? And there's lots of books on Tatas and so on. If you read that, you can see that they're so committed to charity. So in that sense, there is a wonderful intersection of a company that is able to take the values that it lives and what it has been always about, not just now, but for the last 50 years, since the time of independence, and combine that with a product and reflect their value on their sleeves. So that is what you have to do very carefully, but there's no great substitute, but I think those are the right questions. Reflect on who you are, reflect on your capabilities, and also reflect on what the consumers are saying.
Okay, sir. So how do we change that if we have reflected what our values are, but people are not able to get it? For example, if we talk about Tata Nano, so the main purpose of starting and bringing up the car was to provide the four-wheeler car to the families who can't afford such four-wheeler drive. But people in India perceived it as a car that is of low level.
Yeah.
So how do we change that?
Yeah, and I think sometimes you can have mistakes. It wasn't unreasonable for them to sort of think about, hey, we should start a car that can be much more accessible for the common man. But at the same time, it is important to realize that even for that person of the lower socioeconomic class, even for them, that car is a very big purchase, right? It may not be a very big purchase for someone who's very rich, but for that particular person, it is in fact a very substantial purchase, and therefore it cannot come across as something that is lower quality. So that is where, they have to make a pivot, and they have to then get around that new messaging and be able to say, no, you are still buying a very high quality product. So those are pretty standard things that you have to do as you evolve your brands, and you can make mistakes from time to time. But I think what you highlight here is an example of, perhaps not listening deeply enough to a consumer, and noting that it is still very important for people to feel like they're getting a quality product and they're not just getting somebody else's rejects.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Akshat. Now I would like to invite Rupesh. If you can ask a question, Rupesh.
No, my question is about that mostly the marketing is done by emotion, or being rationalism is also being seen there. Means, is it mix of both, more 50-50, or mostly it is emotional based and less of rational based?
So what I've been talking about certainly in my book is to, not use any kind of formula like that, because there isn't such a thing as, when they start doing the CAT scans of the brain, there isn't like, here's an emotion for love, here's a part of the brain that processes happiness, here's a part of the brain that processes anger, and so on. It is really not like that. So that is more of a construct that we use. And there isn't also, for that matter, a system 1 and a system 2, cellular structure in the brain, but that's just a construct for how we think the brain works. So I would say you focus less on whether it's, functional and emotional enough. Focus more on when that consumer is going to make that decision, right? Of buying your brand. What is the prevailing rule, or what is the wisdom, or what is it in their experience that they're going to apply to say this makes for a good choice? That is the
USP of the product, I can say.
Sorry, say that again.
USP of the product, or mainly focus on the USP of the product rather than being more what emotionally that he will buy or not. Means we should focus more on USP, right? That's what you want to say?
Yeah, I think, what is that? I think that part doesn't go away. That what is that core idea that is part of the brand is certainly going to be important always. So, like when I also gave you the example of Act 2 popcorn, right? What they're tapping into is that experience, right? They know that the best experience that people always have, the gold standard of the experiences when eating popcorn is the popcorn that you eat at a movie theater, right? With your girlfriend sitting there right in your arms and what have you. So it is that experience, that people want to tap into when, as a marketer, and sort of make those memories come alive in your mind when you pop that popcorn at your home in your microwave. You're not at the theater, your girlfriend isn't there, but your popcorn is there, but it brings back those same memories. Then you're able to do that. So now, is part of that emotional? Yes, of course it is emotional. And but it is not forced emotional. It is really more focused on, gee, that's the experience that I'm tapping into. So that's what I mean by it.
Yeah, and the other question is about that daily, in the daily there are being seeing changes in the market. Suppose we take an example of technology. Means daily they bring that this product has this great camera, they bring new RAM and fast processors. So how the marketer or the person who is manufacturing a particular product, how he can focus on it? Because every 7 days or 9 days we see something new. So how can he cope up? Because and the consumer is like, oh, this thing we cannot see in your product, which is recently came. So we will think of it, and it means mostly the no about the product when he visits the place to
Yeah.
buy.
And,
So how can
and that is why it's actually important to build brand differentiation versus product differentiation. Because if you only focus on product differentiation, well, that product differentiation is changing every day. Now there's a new camera, now there's a new color, then, everything. So what are you going to do? Change your brand every day? No. And it is, so, for example, when, people, once they start trusting a particular brand. So, if you buy an SUV and the SUV that you trust is the one from Mahindra's or something, right? Then you automatically go and buy the next model of it when it comes up, right? You don't just say, oh, wait a minute, I'm going to see if there's a new camera in it or not, whether this has 5 cameras or 7 cameras or what. You just basically say, okay, this is a brand that I trust. I've had this relationship. And brands brands very much behave like your relationship with your brands is very much like your relationship with people. And you don't change your friends that often, you don't change your wife that often, you don't change your husband that often just because a new person is there with a new feature. And that is the nature of these relationships, and that's why it's important to establish that relationship of trust with the brand before you can and then you won't have to worry about product differentiation. You won't have to chase product differentiation as much.
Like the Apple did, because means people stick to that product, and many models came and people went to buy that product. Still, it reduced its charges and all. People were not least bothered about it because of the brand.
You're so right. I mean, Apple does a great job of that, and Samsung often comes and they come in with the features before Apple does, but people that are Apple people, they wait for Apple to just come up with that feature, right? They don't change their phone to Samsung.
Yeah.
So, and there are many other reasons, but that's a great example, Rupesh.
Thank you, Rupesh. There are other people as well waiting, so I would request.
Sorry, it's okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. So now I would like to invite Professor Jinal Parikh from the marketing area. She has a question. So Professor Jinal, if you can unmute yourself and ask a question.
Good evening, Mr. Dayal. It was a wonderful conversation. I have been hearing you, in whatever sense with the breaking connections, but it was really wonderful to hear you. And the last thing you talked about really is striking a chord with me. And I have also read some excerpts from your book, which talk about brand vibes, brand sense, and brand resolve. These are the three things that you advise the brand should administer in order to keep up the pace and connect to its consumers in terms of cognitive branding. And it's actually fascinating to read about it. But then my question is particularly related to the current scenario, which is kind of a disruption in the branding space as well, where we can, I think, cognitive branding in a way is a lot related to sensory branding as well. But then the disruption that we have seen in terms of the pandemic has made a shift from senses to probably technology. So my question is, how do brand marketers, or how does your model, for instance, change in terms of incorporating maybe, let's say, this augmented reality or virtual reality, where a brand is sensed by the consumers virtually in that sense and not actually physically. So what all would you incorporate in the new model to change the cognitive branding model, where you say that the customer is a deliberator, playing the role of a deliberator or the associator or the learner and then the conator. Now, how does that change when it comes to augmented and virtual reality brands? That's my question.
Sure. Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and I haven't quite explicitly thought about that particular angle, but I guess I should have thought about that. But here, I think from a principles perspective, what I would say is that cognitive branding is about being, making your product a key to tapping into people's past experiences or their fantasies. Now, the fact that people are not able to wander into, let's say, a Starbucks store or a coffee store, and that, you know, they have to enjoy whatever they have to enjoy, but it is not, the experiences have changed, but they haven't gone away, right? Even in the current pandemic environment. And therefore, for brands to maybe update some of their campaigns and so on, to be able to talk about, for example, how people might be still able to enjoy a cup of coffee, you know, even though they're not going to Starbucks, maybe they can, you know, Zoom in with their friends. And a lot of people do that, right? I mean, the people have started organizing events and so on, and they will do wine tasting. For example, in the US, wine tasting is very much a thing. And people will do wine tasting on Zoom. Now you say, well, how are you doing wine tasting on Zoom? But they will, you know, call in somebody that is an expert, right? And that expert is, and they've mailed 3 different wines to you. So, you know, you people, so you've got those same 3 different wines, you're sitting at your own homes and you're talking about what the wine feels like. And so people are creating these new kinds of experiences, because as human beings, we are experiential animals. And you can sort of, in these changing times, you have to sort of update your brands. You would say, like, you know, how can you have a brand around wine which doesn't involve actually going and drinking wine somewhere? But people are doing that. They're doing these Zoom events and so on, where they're creating new experiences where people can recall and remember those moments that they used to have when they were actually meeting in person with their friends. And what happens with the brain is that your past experiences are stored in your mind, and therefore, even when some of those elements are missing, which is in this case, you're not actually in front of your friend, your brain can actually recall the feeling and the experience of being in front of your friend. And therefore, you can do that. So I do think that it challenges marketers, but it doesn't take away from the fact that you can build brands around their experiences and fantasies.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor G.
Great question.
Sandeep, everything is fine now with the connection, and there are 2 more questions. So I would request your 10 minutes more, if that is okay with you.
Sure. Yeah, I have time.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so I would like now to invite Vidhi Chotai to ask a question. Vidhi, if you can unmute yourself and ask a question.
Yeah. Firstly, sir, I really find your book like very interesting. I have written my own book of notes from your book, just to like keep alive. But yeah, my question is like, most of the times consumers do like a brand and they do vibe with it, but somehow they don't end up buying the product and they turn to competitors. And like what I've seen is that, most guys lose after like after brand sense, the point at which brand resolve, like the action of buying the product happens. I think this is mainly because a lot of brands don't really significantly make the consumer's life easier or happier in some way. So how do you think, brands should incline their consumers' mass cognitive more towards the fact that, our product could make them happier, even if it really doesn't?
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of research that is going on these days around this whole idea of intrinsically motivating people. Intrinsic motivation means that you do something out of an innate desire because you want to do it, versus somebody forcing you to do it, which is extrinsic motivation. And so the notion, I think it actually comes down to, and this is what Daisy and Ryan, these are the psychologists that I mentioned at the University of Rochester, what they talk about is that there are 3 things that actually motivate people to take action. So one is, around their ability to express themselves, or to be free and in control of their own destiny, if you will. So there is that. And then there's another piece, which is around expressing your own identity. People like to, develop their own skills. They like to make their identity, their own personal identity, more salient. And then the third thing is that people like to, build and expand their relationships. These are 3 types of things: the ability to be free and in control, the ability to build your identity, and the last one, expand your relationship. These are three things that are highly motivating to people, right? So you should think about, particularly if you're in a situation with a brand where brand vibes and brand sense have not been enough, you must think about how you can use some of these drivers of resolve, these drivers of happiness, these goal pursuits, which is control, identity, relationships, and build that in. And in my book, if you might have seen that, I do mention, for example, the Priceless campaign by MasterCard, which is, where the first few ads, sort of commercials came around, here's a boy and a father and his son that are going to a baseball game, think of it as a cricket game or whatever, and they're buying whatever, a hot dog there, the ticket is whatever, $30, the hot dog is $4, the souvenir shirt is this, but the father-son moment, having those few moments with your son, priceless, right? So what they've done is that they're saying that the MasterCard, it doesn't matter that you're using it to buy these different things. What matters is that you're using it to build your relationships, which is the third piece of Daisy and Ryan's the thesis, which is that you're expanding your relationships. So I'm using my MasterCard to expand my relationships, which is what makes me prefer MasterCard that much more. So that is the thing. The other thing to remember is that sometimes people do all these clever commercials and so on, but they don't relate their product to it. So it's kind of like something that makes you laugh or some cry and this and that. And then you say, well, what's it got to do with the product? No, do what MasterCard has done, which is they take all this wonderful story about the father and son going to a baseball game, but they connect it very centrally to their card, because at each instant in that experience, in that story, you're using your MasterCard to strengthen your bonds with your son, so to speak.
Right, this answers, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Vidhi. Now I would like to call for the last question, Vanisha, if you can come and ask a question.
Good evening, sir, and thank you for the great insights that you have given us. So yeah, I have a question that whenever we visit a supermarket, so let's, for example, Maggi, like Maggi noodles, we have lots of competitors in place there, Yippee noodles and Maggi noodles. But most of the consumers, in fact me, like I myself also pick up Maggi and not Yippee. But for the advertisement part, they have the similar kind of emotions and the 2-minute instant noodle packet and all those of sayings in that ad. But why is it that we always connect to Maggi and not Yippee?
Yeah, I think it goes back to your experiences, because you probably grew up with Maggi, right? And so when you buy Maggi noodles, it brings back, I'm guessing this, I'm sort of putting thoughts in your mind here, but I'm guessing that it brings back those memories of from your childhood of getting those hot Maggi noodles, and it's so much better eating that versus eating lettuce or spinach or something else. So it sort of reminds you of all those wonderful memories that you may have had with your family, with your friends, and so on, sneaking away and having a cup of Maggi noodles. And so when you see that on the shelf, it brings back all those memories. So that's why it's so special for you, because it is bringing those memories. And that's what they do a wonderful job of tapping into the fact that you have these experiences associated. Now, someone who has never eaten Maggi noodles, and you give it to them for the first time, bring it over to Chicago, and I stop somebody in the street and give them Maggi noodles, I'm not sure they're going to like it, by the way, because they don't have those experiences that you had when you grew up as a child, right?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanisha. Sandeep, Neha Mehta is very keen to ask a question. She's saying that my question should be the last one. So
please go ahead.
Yeah, Neha, you can unmute and ask.
So I want to ask that I read an article mentioning the brand loyalty in case of online buying or e-commerce method of buying is reducing in comparison to the traditional buying incidences. So I wanted to ask, sir, why is it so, and what are your views on it?
Yes, so I do think that that's quite possible, because what happens is that the branding experiences that are the strongest are the ones that are most immersive. And you make brand experiences more immersive. And this is going to be important for you guys as you implement and execute your brand strategies. The more senses that are engaged, and this is what people talk about in sensory branding, the more senses that are engaged, the more immersive the experience becomes. So, when we were talking about Starbucks earlier, so when you go to Starbucks, you see whatever, there's a particular environment in that store. There's a particular way in which people are dressed. There are particular aroma of the coffee that is very particular to Arabica beans, because they use 100% Arabica beans. And, there's the coffee cup and your name is written on it and so on. All of these different things are visual cues. They are, smell cues. They are, the music is a particular kind. People actually go to Starbucks and they want to buy the music that they play there, right? Because they're trying to somehow replicate that whole experience that they have in the store and then replicate it at their homes. So all of these different things that you wire in are creating for what I call more immersive experiences. And I, in fact, talk about this whole thing that when you're out there in the real world, you'll go and work with an ad agency and you'll have to write a brand brief, what is called a brand brief, for what you want them to execute in print media, in social media, on television. But I always say to my clients that you should also write a brand brief about what is how the senses are going to be engaged, what visually is going to be engaged, what smells are going to be engaged, what taste is going to be engaged, wherever that is possible, bring all those things in, because when you do that, you make that experience much more immersive. You said, hey, how am I going to do all those things if I'm doing this online? And you're right. I mean, that is much more limiting and harder to do if your brand is purely an online brand, which is why I think what we've seen in the United States is many of the online brands like Warby Parker's, which sells online eyeglasses, for example, they've started opening stores. And the purpose of those stores is not necessarily to sell something, but it is to provide a venue where they can create brand experiences for you. So I think this whole, think of the future world as a multi-channel world, not just online or offline. It's not a competition between the two, but it's going to straddle the two. And you have to create experiences which straddle those online and offline worlds.
Thank you, Vanisha, and thank you so much. Now I would like to invite Professor Ravi Miglani for concluding remarks.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sandeep. This was really insightful and eye-opening for all our audience and for me included. We learned a lot in spite of the glitches and breakdown in the internet services today. But that again kind of brings back the strength of a brand. Your brand, Sandeep, was so strong with us that we overcame all the frictions during the last hour, and we stayed with you because in spite of the friction, we stayed loyal to you. So
thank you.
Brands face frictions, whether it is distribution channel frictions or other frictions. But if you're loyal, like most of us in India, loyal to Maggie, or you would overcome those frictions. Maggie, as all our audience will recall, a few years ago had a very bad PR incident where the authorities asked them to take the product off the shelves because of some real or claimed issues with product quality. That caused some sales dip for a few months, and Maggie came back in full strength because that brand had such great strength in the consumer mind that consumers ignored, and that trust with the brand did not, any other brand would have died with that kind of negative publicity that it got. So we learned a lot about how we build these connections in the consumer mind. Thank you so much for that. And on your last answer on how to build experiences in an online situation where you cannot appeal to all the senses, where you're just seeing a static picture of your product on screen, you are not able to evoke sense of smell and touch and sounds and things that you can create in a physical supermarket. We will get there, I guess, with the metaverse being promised to us by Mr. Zuckerberg and company. We will hopefully be in this, what you were calling an immersive experience that straddles online and offline, where all of us would seamlessly move from online to offline, and experiences will be carried forward from one sphere to the other. So hopefully this relatively less immersive online e-commerce experience is about to change. So thank you for all those great ideas. We and our students learned a lot. To make up for this unstable discussion over the last hour, we promised to bring you to Ahmedabad as soon as and we would want to. There were so many questions in my mind, which we didn't get to because half the time we couldn't hear each other. So we'll bring you to Ahmedabad. So like we say, the conversation series webinars is just a conversation starter. It's not the end of the conversation. So we'll continue that in person over some Maggi noodles in our campus.
Yeah, so thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's it's always very enjoyable for me to interact with students because at the end of the day, just like one of your students mentioned, I hope they're taking notes and all of those stuff, and that they are going to take these ideas forward into the world, because it is they who are going to change the future of brands, not people like me who have kind of done their bit. So I do look forward to having a time when the pandemic is over and that we can straddle that offline experience of being in front of students and being able to share their ideas, because they are in fact the brightest minds that will change the world in the future.
Thank you.
So
Thank you.
now we'll close this, and I understand why William Shakespeare in 16th, 15th century said that all is well if that ends well. Today I have really enjoyed this, and I understood. And in fact, that play looks like a romantic play, but it is actually called a problem play because it poses a lot of questions for people and ethical questions to kind of consider in those days until today. And your conversation also posed a lot of questions, a lot of curiosity. And I'm also very happy to see that most of the students have bought the book and taken note and asking so insightful questions, and they are really keen to have you on our campus, Sandeep. So thank you so much for doing this, and thanks everybody for staying with us.